The easiest people to replace are usually the ones holding everything together. Vincent Romano believed that sentence was nonsense. At 38 years old, the white-haired Mafia boss had built an empire by trusting numbers instead of emotions, efficiency instead of sentiment, and results instead of excuses. Every room inside his sprawling New York mansion reflected that philosophy, from the polished marble floors to the perfectly organized offices where every employee understood one simple rule. If you no longer served a purpose, someone else would take your place. That belief had never failed him. So when his morning schedule listed a meeting with the mansion librarian, he expected it to last no more than 5 minutes. Eleanor Hayes quietly entered his office carrying a leather notebook against her chest. She was a plus-size woman in her early 30s with kind brown eyes, neatly pinned auburn hair, and the calm confidence of someone who never needed attention to know her own worth. Unlike the executives and advisors who constantly competed for Vincent's approval, Eleanor never raised her voice or rushed to impress anyone. She simply did her work every single day. Vincent looked up from a stack of financial reports without offering a greeting. "I reviewed the annual expenses," he said. "The library is costing this estate money without creating measurable value." Eleanor remained composed. "The library is more than shelves of books." Vincent folded his hands together. "That may have been true years ago. Times change." She nodded gently instead of arguing. "Knowledge does not stop being valuable because it is quiet." The answer irritated him more than open resistance would have. Quiet does not produce profit. Eleanor looked around the office, her eyes briefly resting on the family portraits decorating the walls. Not everything valuable can be measured by a spreadsheet. Vincent leaned back in his chair. "That sounds inspiring, but inspiration is not a business strategy." The room became still. Outside the tall windows, gardeners carefully trimmed hedges while luxury cars rolled through the front gate. Inside, only the ticking of an antique clock filled the silence. Finally, Vincent slid an envelope across the polished desk. "Today will be your last day. Human resources will handle the paperwork. Your position has been eliminated." Eleanor lowered her eyes to the envelope, but did not immediately pick it up. For a brief moment, Vincent expected disappointment, perhaps an emotional plea or an attempt to negotiate. Instead, she offered a small, genuine smile. "Thank you for letting me care for the library." The unexpected response caught him off guard. "That is all you have to say?" She nodded. People rarely change their minds when they have already decided someone no longer matters. Without another word, she accepted the envelope, removed a small brass key from her pocket, and placed it gently on his desk. "The master key to the archives," she said softly. "Everything is labeled. I hope whoever comes next enjoys taking care of them." Vincent barely glanced at the key. "Someone will." Eleanor gave one final polite nod before walking toward the door. She did not slam it. She did not cry. She simply disappeared into the quiet hallway with the same dignity she had carried every day she worked there. Throughout the afternoon, employees noticed something unusual. Eleanor stopped at nearly every department before leaving. She thanked the kitchen staff for always recommending new recipes to visiting authors. She wished the gardeners a wonderful summer. She reminded the security team where several forgotten family records had been safely stored. She even left handwritten notes inside books that children from the neighborhood often borrowed during community reading afternoons. No one realized those simple conversations would become memories before sunset. As evening settled over the mansion, Vincent signed contracts, answered phone calls, and congratulated himself for cutting another unnecessary expense. The library lights were switched off for the first time in years. The long hallways seemed strangely empty, though he dismissed the feeling as coincidence. He left his office believing tomorrow would be even more efficient than today. But when the first rays of sunlight reached the mansion the following morning, an unsettling silence spread through every corridor, and for reasons no one could explain, not a single person inside the estate seemed to know where to begin their day. The mansion had always awakened before sunrise with quiet precision, yet this morning every familiar routine seemed to dissolve into uncertainty. Housekeepers stood outside storage rooms searching for supply lists that had always appeared exactly where they were needed. The kitchen staff gathered around the breakfast schedule, realizing no one knew which guests had dietary preferences or which visiting business partners were expected later that afternoon. The security team quietly compared handwritten notes. each believing someone else possessed the updated records. Instead of purposeful footsteps filling the marble hallways, hesitant whispers echoed from room to room. Vincent Romano noticed the difference the moment he walked downstairs. Normally, fresh coffee waited on the dining table beside a folder containing his appointments, reminders, and carefully organized reference materials. That morning, only the coffee remained. The folder was missing. He frowned, but assumed someone had simply made an unusual mistake. "Where is today's briefing?" he asked. Several employees exchanged uncertain glances before the estate manager answered. "We are looking for it now, sir." Vincent checked his watch. "Looking for it? It should already be here." The manager swallowed nervously. "No one seems to know where the master planning records are stored." Vincent sighed impatiently. "Then create new ones." The response sounded simple enough, but no one moved. Each employee knew only a small piece of the mansion's daily operations. Somehow, those pieces had always fit together perfectly until today. A young assistant hurried into the room, carrying several folders. "Sir, the guest archive is incomplete. We cannot find the notes about your business partners from Boston." Vincent reached for another cabinet himself, only to discover shelves filled with neatly labeled binders that suddenly seemed impossible to navigate. The labels made sense individually, yet the overall system felt like a language only one person had truly understood. Meanwhile, the florist arrived asking where seasonal arrangements should be placed for an upcoming charity gathering. The event coordinator admitted she was unsure because Eleanor had always balanced the preferences of every department without making it obvious. Minutes later, the head chef approached with another question. "Sir, there are children visiting the community reading room this weekend. Should we still prepare lunches?" Vincent looked surprised. "Community reading room?" The chef nodded. "Miss Hayes organized it every month. She said it honored your late mother's love of books." Vincent paused. He had almost forgotten his mother had once dreamed of opening the mansion library to neighborhood children. He dismissed the thought and replied, "Cancel it." The chef hesitated before quietly leaving. Throughout the morning, interruptions continued. A delivery driver arrived with rare historical volumes nobody remembered ordering. A university professor called to confirm next week's research appointment, unaware the librarian was gone. An elderly donor left a message thanking Eleanor for preserving generations of family letters that had nearly been lost decades earlier. Vincent became increasingly frustrated. None of these responsibilities had appeared in financial reports, yet every phone call revealed another invisible connection quietly holding the estate together. Shortly before noon, he walked toward the library for the first time in months. Dust had not settled overnight, and every shelf remained perfectly organized. Sunlight poured through tall windows onto polished wooden tables where reading lamps stood exactly as Eleanor had left them. The silence inside the room felt different from the silence outside. It was peaceful rather than empty. Vincent noticed a small notebook resting neatly beside the circulation desk. He opened it expecting personal thoughts, but instead found nothing except carefully updated maintenance reminders, preservation schedules, community contacts, and encouraging notes thanking employees for their hard work. There was not a single complaint, not one bitter sentence. Every page focused on helping someone else succeed. Vincent slowly closed the notebook. For the first time since making his decision, an uncomfortable question entered his mind. If Eleanor had truly been unnecessary, why did every missing answer seem to begin with her name? By the second day, the mansion no longer felt like the perfectly synchronized home it had always been. Nothing had collapsed in a dramatic way, yet everything moved just slowly enough to remind people that something essential was missing. Vincent Romano watched employees hesitate before making even simple decisions. The confidence that once defined the estate had quietly disappeared. He refused to believe one librarian could be responsible for such a change, but the evidence kept finding its way to his desk. Late that morning, the head housekeeper approached with a worn notebook in her hands. "Sir, I found this while organizing the linen room." Vincent accepted it without much interest until he noticed Eleanor's familiar handwriting filling every page. It was not an official record. Instead, it contained thoughtful reminders about the people who worked in the mansion. One employee's daughter was applying for college and appreciated encouraging words before important exams. Another staff member cared for an elderly father and sometimes needed a slightly later shift on Fridays. The gardener preferred planting roses near the eastern courtyard because the morning sunlight lasted longer there. The kitchen assistant dreamed of attending culinary school and borrowed cookbooks from the library every month. None of those details appeared to have anything to do with books, yet Eleanor had remembered every one of them. Vincent closed the notebook slowly. Why would she write all of this? The housekeeper smiled sadly. Because she remembered people, sir. We only discovered how much after she left. Before Vincent could respond, another employee knocked on the office door. It was the estate accountant carrying several old financial folders. Sir, there is something you should probably see. Inside the folders were neatly attached notes explaining unusual expenses from previous years. Every additional cost that had once seemed unnecessary now had a simple explanation. Eleanor had negotiated donations of rare books instead of expensive purchases. She had organized community reading events that quietly strengthened relationships with local charities. She had preserved historical documents that later helped resolve legal questions about family property. Each decision had saved the estate time, money, or trust, yet she had never placed her own name beside any accomplishment. Throughout the afternoon, more stories surfaced naturally. The chauffeur recalled how Eleanor always kept children's books in the back seat whenever families visited with young guests. The groundskeeper remembered that she personally researched the history of every tree planted on the property so visitors could enjoy guided walks. The receptionist admitted Eleanor often stayed after hours to help employees study for certification exams because she believed education opened doors that fear could never unlock. None of them spoke with exaggerated emotion. They simply shared ordinary memories that suddenly felt extraordinary because no one had realized how quietly she had shaped daily life. Vincent found himself walking through the library again before sunset. This time he looked beyond the shelves. Framed photographs hung near the reading corner, showing charity events, neighborhood children smiling with books, retired teachers visiting the estate, and local students receiving scholarships funded anonymously through the Romano Foundation. Until that moment, Vincent had assumed his public relations department managed those programs. A small engraved plaque beneath one photograph read, "Knowledge grows strongest when it is shared with kindness." There was no signature. He already knew who had written it. Standing in the silent room, Vincent finally understood the mistake he had made. Eleanor had never been the woman who simply organized books. She had quietly preserved memories, connected strangers, encouraged dreams, solved problems before anyone noticed them, and carried the invisible responsibilities that allowed everyone else to believe the mansion functioned effortlessly. The library had never been the heart of the estate because of the books it contained. It had been the heart because of the woman who welcomed every person through its doors without ever asking for recognition. And for the first time in many years, Vincent realized that some losses could not be measured until the silence they left behind became impossible to ignore. Vincent Romano did not allow himself to dwell on regret for very long. He had built his reputation by making difficult decisions and refusing to reverse them simply because they became uncomfortable. As he left the library that evening, he convinced himself the mansion only needed time to adjust. Every organization experienced temporary setbacks after personnel changes, and this would be no different. "We will reorganize," he told the estate manager the following morning. "Document every responsibility. Assign clear ownership. We will not depend on one person again." The manager nodded respectfully, although uncertainty lingered in his expression. New charts were created, meetings were scheduled, and responsibilities were divided among multiple departments. On paper, the solution looked efficient. In reality, each task revealed another hidden connection that no chart could explain. The reception desk received a call from a museum requesting access to several historical journals for an educational exhibit. No one knew which collection the journals belonged to or why the museum trusted the Romano estate in the first place. The accounting office discovered several annual scholarship payments that had always been approved without delay, yet there was no explanation of which students depended on them. The legal department searched for decades-old family correspondence requested by an attorney handling an estate matter, only to realize the filing system Eleanor had built relied on relationships between documents rather than simple alphabetical order. Each department completed part of the work, but none of them understood the complete picture she had quietly carried in her mind. Vincent remained determined to prove that the transition would eventually stabilize. During an afternoon strategy meeting, one executive suggested hiring an experienced archivist from another city. Another recommended outsourcing the entire library collection to a private historical institution. Vincent listened carefully before approving interviews with several highly qualified candidates. By the end of the week, 3 respected professionals had toured the mansion. Each praised the impressive collection of books and records, yet every one of them asked the same question before leaving. May we meet the person who designed this organizational system? When they learned she no longer worked there, their confidence noticeably faded. One candidate politely admitted, "The collection is extraordinary, but understanding it completely could take years." Vincent thanked them for their honesty, though the answer unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Later that afternoon, he walked through the east hallway and noticed something unusual. The reading corner that had once welcomed neighborhood children now sat completely empty. The colorful cushions remained neatly arranged. Tiny wooden chairs stood exactly where they had always been, and shelves filled with children's books waited silently for readers who never arrived. A little girl appeared at the front entrance holding her father's hand. She looked through the glass doors toward the library with hopeful eyes before asking the receptionist, "Is Miss Eleanor here today?" The receptionist smiled gently. "She does not work here anymore." The child lowered her head. "She promised she would help me finish my reading challenge this summer." Her father thanked the receptionist politely and quietly led his daughter away. Vincent watched the exchange from across the hall without saying a word. The disappointment on the child's face lingered in his thoughts long after they had left. That evening, the mansion hosted a small dinner with longtime business partners. Normally, conversations flowed naturally because guests often wandered into the library before meals, discovering family history, rare collections, or local stories that created easy connections. This time, everyone remained in the formal dining room. The conversation felt polite but distant, and the evening ended much earlier than expected. As the final guests departed, Vincent stood alone near the entrance, listening once again to the unfamiliar silence surrounding the estate. He had removed one employee believing he was eliminating an unnecessary expense. Instead, day after day, he was discovering that Eleanor had never simply managed books. She had quietly created countless moments that allowed strangers to become friends, employees to become a family, and an enormous mansion to feel like a welcoming home. For the first time since making his decision, Vincent stopped asking how the estate could function without her and began asking himself a far more difficult question. Why had he never truly seen her while she was standing right in front of him? The questions Vincent Romano could no longer answer followed him through every hallway of the mansion, but none of them troubled him more than the one he had asked himself the previous evening. Why had he never truly noticed Eleanor Hayes? Days passed, yet her absence seemed to grow larger instead of smaller. Every employee continued doing their best, but the warmth that had once filled the estate had quietly faded. One rainy afternoon, the elderly butler, Samuel Whitmore, knocked gently on Vincent's office door, carrying a small wooden box. "Sir," he said softly, "I believe this belongs to you now." Vincent looked at the weathered box with curiosity. "What is it?" Samuel carefully placed it on the desk. "Miss Hayes asked me to give it to you only if she was no longer here." Vincent slowly lifted the lid. Inside rested a neatly folded letter, several old photographs, and a faded leather bookmark bearing the Romano family crest. He unfolded the letter first, expecting criticism or disappointment. Instead, he found calm, graceful handwriting. "Mr. Romano, if you are reading this, I hope the mansion continues to thrive. There are a few projects that may need attention over the coming months. The scholarship fund for local students renews every September. Mrs. Dawson at the community center will call about the annual reading festival. Professor Collins may request access to your grandfather's journals for historical research. The maple tree beside the east garden should be inspected before winter because your mother always worried about its oldest branches. Thank you for allowing me to care for these responsibilities. I sincerely wish you and everyone in the mansion happiness." Vincent reached the final line and realized there was not a single complaint anywhere on the page. No mention of being dismissed. No attempt to defend herself. She had used her final letter only to help the people who had let her go. He quietly set the paper down before picking up the photographs. The first showed Eleanor standing beside neighborhood children during a summer reading event, each child proudly holding a new book. The second captured elderly veterans sharing stories with local students inside the mansion library. The third surprised him the most. It showed his late father smiling beside a much younger Eleanor during the renovation of the library nearly 15 years earlier. Vincent stared at the image. "Samuel," he asked quietly, "how long did she work here?" The old butler smiled gently. "Almost 15 years, sir." Vincent looked up in disbelief. 15. Samuel nodded. "She started shortly after your father invited her to organize the family archives. At the time, she had just earned her graduate degree in library science. She received several attractive offers from universities, but your father convinced her to stay for 1 year." Vincent frowned. "Then why did she never leave?" Samuel's expression softened with memory. "Because your father asked her to promise one thing. He believed this mansion should always remain a place where knowledge was shared freely, not locked away behind wealth. Miss Hayes promised she would protect that dream for as long as she could." Vincent lowered his eyes toward the old bookmark resting inside the box. Suddenly, he remembered seeing Eleanor countless times over the years carrying stacks of books through the hallways, greeting employees by name, quietly arranging events he had rarely attended. She had never asked for recognition because she believed the work itself mattered more than applause. Samuel spoke again before leaving. "Your father often said that buildings are maintained with money, but homes are preserved by people who care." Miss Hayes understood that better than anyone. After the butler quietly closed the office door, Vincent remained alone with the letter spread across his desk. For the first time since becoming head of the Romano family, the certainty that had always guided every decision began to crack. He had believed strength meant never looking back, yet the simple kindness written across those pages made him realize that pride had blinded him far more than any mistake ever could. And deep inside, he knew that finding another librarian would never replace the one person who had spent 15 years protecting not just the family's books, but the very spirit of the place they called home. The following morning, Vincent Romano canceled every non-essential meeting for the first time in years. His assistants exchanged surprised glances, but no one questioned the decision. He placed Eleanor Hayes's letter carefully inside his briefcase, picked up the faded leather bookmark, and quietly left the mansion without the usual convoy of luxury vehicles. He wanted no audience and no ceremony. Samuel had mentioned hearing that Eleanor recently accepted a temporary position at a small community library on the northern edge of the city. It was nearly an hour away from the Romano estate, tucked between a neighborhood park and an old brick church where families gathered every weekend. The building itself was modest, with flower boxes beneath the windows and a hand-painted sign welcoming visitors of all ages. As Vincent stepped inside, he immediately noticed something that had been missing from his own mansion for weeks. Laughter. Children sat cross-legged on colorful rugs listening to a volunteer read aloud from an adventure novel. 2 retired teachers helped teenagers prepare for college entrance exams. A young mother smiled as her son proudly carried home his very first library card. The room felt alive without being loud, peaceful without being empty. Then Vincent saw Eleanor. She stood beside a rolling cart filled with books, smiling warmly as she guided an elderly man toward a history section. Her auburn hair was tied back just as neatly as before, and her calm expression had not changed. The only difference was the lightness in her face. She no longer carried the invisible weight of an enormous estate. Here, surrounded by ordinary neighbors, she seemed completely at home. Before Vincent could approach her, a little girl ran toward Eleanor, holding an open chapter book. "Miss Eleanor," the child called excitedly. "I finished it all by myself." Eleanor knelt beside her with genuine pride. "I knew you could do it. Which story should we discover next?" The little girl thought for a moment before wrapping her arms around Eleanor in a quick hug. "The biggest one you have." Eleanor laughed softly. "Then let us find a very big adventure." Vincent watched the exchange from several feet away, suddenly remembering the disappointed child who had visited the mansion asking for Miss Eleanor only days earlier. He finally understood that those moments had never been small. They had quietly shaped lives in ways that could never appear on financial reports. When the afternoon reading session ended and the library became quieter, Eleanor noticed Vincent standing near the entrance. Surprise crossed her face, but only for a brief moment. She walked toward him with the same steady composure she had always carried. "Good afternoon, Mr. Romano," she said kindly. "I hope everyone at the mansion is doing well." Vincent found himself searching for the confident words that had once come so easily. Instead, he answered honestly, "No, they are not." Eleanor studied his expression but did not interrupt. "The mansion is functioning," he continued, "but it no longer feels the same." She nodded gently. "People eventually adjust to change." Vincent slowly shook his head. "I believe that too. Now I am not so certain." For several quiet seconds, neither of them spoke. Children laughed outside the windows while volunteers returned books to nearby shelves. Finally, Vincent looked around the welcoming room before meeting Eleanor's eyes again. "I came because I needed to see something for myself." She tilted her head slightly. "And what was that?" He took a slow breath. "I wanted to know whether the warmth disappeared from my mansion because you left, or whether you simply carried it with you wherever you went." Eleanor looked around the cheerful library before smiling softly. "Kindness has never belonged to a building, Mr. Romano. It belongs to the people who choose to practice it every day." Her words settled into the silence between them, and for the first time in many years, Vincent realized he had not traveled across the city to ask a former employee to return. He had come because he needed to understand how someone he had underestimated possessed a kind of quiet influence that power, wealth, and authority had never been able to create. Vincent Romano remained in the community library long after the last family had checked out their books. The peaceful rhythm of the building stood in sharp contrast to the constant urgency that defined life inside his mansion. Eleanor Hayes finished arranging a display of classic American novels before turning toward him once more. "Would you like to sit for a few minutes?" she asked politely. Vincent nodded. They settled at a small wooden table near a window overlooking the neighborhood park. Children played on the swings while parents chatted on nearby benches. It was an ordinary afternoon, yet Vincent could not remember the last time he had simply watched life move without rushing to control it. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "I owe you an apology." Eleanor listened without interrupting. "When I dismissed you, I believed I was removing a position that no longer mattered. I judged your value without taking the time to understand your work or the person behind it. I was wrong." Eleanor looked down at her folded hands before answering quietly. "Thank you for saying that." Vincent continued, his voice calmer than she had ever heard it. "Since you left, I have learned more about what you accomplished in 15 years than I knew during all the years you worked for me. Every day someone tells me another story about your kindness or another responsibility you carried without recognition. I should have known long before now." Eleanor smiled gently, but there was sadness in her eyes rather than satisfaction. "Recognition was never what I wanted." Vincent leaned forward. "Then come back. The library belongs with you. The mansion needs you. I need your help fixing what I damaged." Eleanor remained silent for several moments before lifting her eyes to meet his. "Mr. Romano, may I ask you something?" "Of course. If the mansion had continued running perfectly after I left, would you be sitting here today?" The question lingered between them. Vincent opened his mouth to answer, but found no honest words. He slowly lowered his gaze. Eleanor understood his silence before he did. "That is why I cannot say yes," she said softly. "Not today." Vincent looked back at her with quiet disappointment. "Because you do not forgive me?" She shook her head. "Forgiveness is not the problem." "Then what is?" Eleanor rested her hands on the table. "You apologized because you discovered how much I contributed after I was gone. I appreciate that. Truly. But respect should never depend on someone becoming impossible to replace." Vincent listened carefully. "The day you dismissed me, you had already decided what my work was worth before asking a single question about it. You saw shelves filled with books, but you never saw the people connected through them. You saw an expense instead of a purpose. That hurt far more than losing the job." Her words were gentle, yet each sentence carried undeniable truth. She continued with the same calm voice she had always used. "A sincere apology is meaningful, but lasting respect is shown through changed behavior, not changed feelings." Vincent nodded slowly. "You are right." Eleanor smiled kindly. "I believe people can grow. I have seen it happen many times. That is why libraries exist. Every book teaches that tomorrow does not have to look like yesterday. But growth cannot happen in a single conversation." Outside the window, the afternoon sun dipped lower as families began walking home with books tucked beneath their arms. Vincent rose from his chair and carefully removed the old leather bookmark from his jacket pocket. "Your letter and this bookmark reminded me of my father's dream," he said. "I almost forgot what he wanted this place to become." Eleanor accepted the bookmark, but gently placed it back into his hand. "Keep it for now. It belongs with the person who is willing to protect that dream." Vincent understood she was not rejecting him. She was giving him something far more difficult than forgiveness. She was giving him the opportunity to become the kind of leader who earned trust instead of expecting it. And as he quietly walked toward the library door, he realized his journey had only just begun. Dewey de la Fin Ban Part 8 Duok Tang Them Mot Thursday Thatch No Truok Kai Dan Sang Part 9 Thursday Thatch Nai Keen Vincent Phi Chung Min Su Thay Doi Bang Su Kien Tri Chu Kong Chi Bang Mot by Fat Bu Hei Kak Chin Sach Moi Dunai Jup Part 9 Tro Nin Thuyet Phuc Vakam Suk Han. Vincent Romano returned to the mansion with Eleanor's words echoing in his mind long after the drive home ended. For the first time in his career, he resisted the urge to solve a problem by issuing another order. He understood that inviting Eleanor back again before changing himself would only prove she had been right. Respect could not be requested. It had to be demonstrated. The following morning, every employee received an unexpected invitation to gather in the main hall. Whispered conversations filled the room as housekeepers, gardeners, chefs, security officers, office assistants, and maintenance workers stood together waiting for Vincent to speak. Normally, those meetings focused on schedules, financial goals, or operational updates. This one felt different before he said a single word. Vincent stepped to the front without prepared notes. He looked around the room, recognizing faces he had passed for years without truly seeing. "I asked all of you here because I need to admit something," he began. "I have spent too much of my life measuring people only by the tasks I could see. I believed efficiency alone made this estate successful. I was mistaken. Every person working here contributes something valuable. Some contributions appear in reports. Others appear in the way you support one another every day. I failed to recognize that difference, and I intend to change it." The employees exchanged surprised glances. No one could remember Vincent ever speaking so openly. He announced several immediate changes. Every department would hold monthly listening sessions where employees could share ideas without fear of dismissal. Educational courses would be funded for any staff member hoping to learn new skills. The scholarship program Eleanor had quietly protected would continue exactly as planned, with additional support for local students. The children's reading weekends would return, and the historic library would remain the heart of the estate rather than becoming another financial asset. During the following weeks, Vincent walked through every department instead of remaining inside his office. He learned the names of employees' families, listened before making decisions, and thanked people whose work had previously gone unnoticed. Slowly, conversations that had once been filled with hesitation became more confident. Then an unexpected challenge tested whether his change was genuine. A major investor scheduled a private visit to discuss future business opportunities. After touring the estate, the visitor criticized the expanded community programs, suggesting they reduced the mansion's exclusive image. He recommended canceling the public reading events, ending the scholarship fund, and converting the library into an invitation-only executive archive. Months earlier, Vincent would have accepted that advice without hesitation. Instead, he calmly replied, "The library is no longer measured only by the value of the books inside it. It is measured by the lives it improves." The investor warned that supporting community programs might weaken future partnerships. Vincent remained composed. "Then I am prepared to lose opportunities that require me to abandon the values this estate now stands for." The meeting ended without an agreement. Several senior advisors privately questioned his decision, reminding him how much influence the investor carried. Vincent simply answered, "If protecting people costs me a contract, then I chose the right investment." News of the conversation quietly spread through the mansion. Employees realized his earlier speech had not been empty words. He was willing to defend the changes even when they carried a personal cost. Weeks later, Mrs. Dawson from the community center visited Eleanor's library with donated books and casually mentioned what had happened. "Mr. Romano surprised everyone," she said with a smile. "He turned down a very profitable opportunity because he refused to close the reading programs. He said some things were worth more than money." A few days later, Professor Collins shared another story about Vincent personally helping students explore the family archives during an educational tour, while Samuel wrote Eleanor a brief letter explaining that the mansion finally felt united again, not because people feared their employer, but because they trusted him. Eleanor never asked for those updates, yet they continued reaching her through people with nothing to gain from praising Vincent. One evening, as she locked the doors of the community library, she stood quietly beneath the fading light and realized something had changed. For the first time since leaving the mansion, she was no longer wondering whether Vincent regretted losing her. She was beginning to believe he had truly become the leader he had promised to become, even when no one expected him to prove it. Nearly 3 months passed before Vincent Romano returned to the community library. This time he arrived without uncertainty, without expectations, and without asking anyone to announce his visit. He quietly stepped through the front door, carrying a single leather portfolio. Eleanor Hayes looked up from helping a group of middle school students choose books for a history project and greeted him with the same calm smile she offered every visitor. When the students left, Vincent placed the portfolio on the reading table between them. "This is not a job offer," he said gently. "I wanted you to see what has changed." Eleanor opened the portfolio and slowly turned each page. Inside were photographs of the restored reading room at the mansion, schedules for expanded community literacy programs, scholarship reports showing additional students receiving financial assistance, and plans for preserving the Romano family archives, while making selected historical collections available to local schools and universities. She also found handwritten letters from employees. The head chef thanked Vincent for listening to ideas that had once been ignored. The groundskeeper wrote that the estate finally felt like a place where every voice mattered. The receptionist shared that neighborhood families no longer viewed the mansion as an intimidating symbol of wealth, but as a welcoming place to learn. None of the letters had been requested. They had been written freely. Eleanor quietly closed the portfolio. "You did not come here to convince me," she said. Vincent shook his head. "No, I came because you deserve to know that your work continues to grow, even while you have been away." She studied him for a long moment before asking, "If I never return, will those programs continue?" "Yes," Vincent answered without hesitation. "They are no longer promises made for one conversation. They are part of who this estate will be." Eleanor smiled, and this time the warmth reached her eyes. "Then I believe you have finally understood your father's dream." A week later, the mansion hosted its annual community reading celebration. Families filled the gardens. Children laughed beneath the old maple tree, retired teachers shared stories, and volunteers guided visitors through the historic library. Vincent welcomed every guest personally, never expecting anything more than another successful afternoon serving the neighborhood. As the event continued, Samuel quietly approached him with a knowing smile. "Sir," the elderly butler whispered, "you may want to look toward the front entrance." Vincent turned and saw Eleanor walking through the open doors carrying a canvas bag filled with books. Several children recognized her immediately and hurried over with joyful greetings. Employees who had worked beside her for years smiled with genuine happiness, but no one rushed to pressure her into returning. They simply welcomed her back as a respected friend. Eleanor eventually made her way to Vincent. "I have thought about your invitation," she said. Vincent waited patiently. "I cannot come back as the person I used to be." "I would never ask you to," he replied. She nodded. "Then I would like to accept a different role." Vincent listened carefully. "I would like to lead the Romano Foundation Library and Community Education Program." The mansion library can become the center of something much larger than one collection of books. It can help children discover opportunities, preserve local history, and remind every visitor that learning belongs to everyone. Vincent smiled with quiet gratitude. That is exactly what this place should become. From that day forward, the mansion changed in ways no financial report could ever fully measure. The library became the heart of countless community events, scholarship programs expanded every year, and employees proudly described the estate as a place where kindness and knowledge were valued alongside excellence. Visitors often admired the impressive collection of rare books. Yet those who returned again and again understood the true treasure had never been the shelves themselves. It had always been the people who welcomed others with respect, generosity, and compassion. Years later, a small bronze plaque was placed beside the library entrance. It did not celebrate wealth, power, or influence. Instead, it carried a simple message that every guest paused to read before stepping inside. A house becomes a home when every person is seen, every voice is valued, and every act of kindness is remembered. And whenever Vincent passed those words, he quietly smiled, because he knew the greatest lesson of his life had never been hidden inside an extraordinary book. It had been living beside him all along in an extraordinary woman he had finally learned to see.